Here is 3 Oysters Doldam, a green ink.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
This is a nice mid-tone of a dusty green. Not what I was really expecting, both from the chromatography and the swatch. Made me think that this was going to be a brown, and I was wrong. There is a fairly consistent tone across the paper and almost always shades well and enjoyably. Now, on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it can spread and it can feather, but that can be expected from some of the non-fountain pen friendly papers. Not that many of them really show up in these reviews because I've kind of curated the papers that get used quite a bit. This mid-tone of green with decent shading is very nice, and I would happily use up a bottle if I was given one. But I don't think that I would buy a bottle for myself, so it falls in that realm of I enjoy it, but I don't know that I would go to buy a bottle.
The pen for today is a Mnemosyne Fission with a broad nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontain.
And here we see that nice mid-tone, really refreshing as a tone. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. The shading that goes on is fairly good. There's no real drawbacks to it. When you look at drawbacks on the second line, where the D is lighter than the R, that got quite a bit darker. The AW began lighter but worked their way darker through the W. The BAC is lighter, the K darkens up some, and the S darkens up some. Now, the reason to look at drawbacks is there are faint moments of haloing. You see it on the R and the right side of the W, that little bit of outlining that's going on. You also get to see a little bit of it in the S at the end. I was not expecting any haloing out of this ink, but it is there. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer.
Here is 3 Oysters Americano.
Here is 3 Oysters Black Moss. Here is 3 Oysters Mustard. Here is 3 Oysters Greule Hanoil. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
As a tone, what we get is just a little bit lighter, just a little bit flatter than what we had on the Clairfontain. No feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. Mr. Baggins would be happy when you look at Baggins on the second line. As an aside, Mr. Baggins was my last dog's name. It just worked. Now, the thing is, the B starts lighter, works its way a little darker. It lightens up through the rest of again, but the S at the end does get a bit darker again. Also, very interesting is that haloing does show up on that S. It also shows up on the N on the left side of Thorin directly underneath it, making this such a great ink. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and we can easily write back here, so Mr. Baggins would be happy.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone we get here on the page is a little bit lighter, but with that, a little fresher, a green. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it barely shades. You see a tiny bit of shading in the N of ring on the first line, or the D of found on the second line. Barely. There's also a tiny bit of feathering that goes on. You see it in the F of found on the second line. You see it in the exclamation point on the second line. It's there, but it's not going to be something that's a problem in this writing. It is not spreading, so it's just a tiny bit of imperfection every now and then. And the day that I make a mistake in a video, I will accept imperfection into my life with some inks, and luckily, I don't know that I have made a video without mistakes, so I get to accept some imperfections. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We can write back here with no problem.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
We have the same tone as the Clairfontain. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontain. It does stand out from the quad rule. It separates itself from it. However, if you look at if on the third line, you're going to see sometimes these vertical lines cut the ink a little bit, which makes for a moment of distraction and makes you see the quad rule some. So it's kind of a hit or miss on how it's going with the quad rule, because it didn't do that all the time. Numbered on the second line, no problem. Also numbered on the second line, had great shading. So I'm going to call this a hit or miss depending on you with this paper. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue taking notes back here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman SBRE Brown.
Here is Aurora Sepia.
Here is Diamine Tobacco Sunburst.
Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Cognac Brown. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
The color we're getting on the page is certainly lighter and duller, flatter, less interesting than we had on the Clairfontain. Now for performance, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading, but it's lost that little bit of a something to it. It stands out from the quad rule still here. It's not being cut by the quad rule the way it was sometimes with the Rhodia. I'm not going to call this a loss for a student if they used it. I think this is a very good ink if a student chose to use it. It's just not as interesting in tone as it was on the Clairfontain. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can continue our lab notes, letting that student get better economy out of these notebooks.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Sailor Manyo Sakura.
Here is Diamine Magical Forest. Here is Pilot Fuyugaku Winter Persimmon. Here is Krishna Monsoon Sky.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
The color we're getting here is lighter, is duller, is less interesting. There's almost nothing for feathering. So I really want to move past it because that's not a problem here. There is a little bit of a spread. That's not really a problem here. There is a little bit of shading going on, which is very nice for this ink on this paper. I think this ink on this paper is a very good combination, especially if you were to go with a finer nib. This is a broad nib on the paper, not the best situation for this. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, you see how deep this ink did get into the paper, so you can't take notes back here, but it did not touch the page underneath. So it did very well, considering what we're writing on.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Mnemosyne Fission has a medium flow broad nib and gives a kind of a fresh and muted green with decent shading. Now, I used a very wet fine off camera and it did darken it up a little bit, but not for the best, as the look became less interesting. So I would say to go for a medium flow medium or a stub to increase the shading. This is where I think the magic for this ink is really going to happen and bring out everything best about this ink.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.